Right. Thanks for having me here and welcome everyone. And I realize this is in the middle of the best summer season, and I am here in Finland. But despite the fact that I am in Finland, as you can hear, a lot of my work has been actually in North America for the past 20 years. So this presentation will build on the previous two webinars, where the first one was focusing on the biophysical and biophysical aspects of the climate change impacts on boreal forest. And the second one was community. And this one is now then bringing those together, the knowledge co-production. And that I will be focusing mostly on the process with a few examples. And the way I decided to focus on today is this twofold challenge that we have. The first one is the one that we all share, or technically we share all of them, but the one that we are working, studying boreal forest and forest governance or management science related to that in different ways to ensure the resilience of boreal forest and their health. And the second one, which this presentation is focusing significantly much more on, is the problem that we have that we all work in silos. And that is the part that has created a lot of the troubles that we have. At the same time, we have gathered a fantastic amount of information and knowledge that we need to harness. When I was preparing for this, I did a quick Scopus search looking at boreal forest research, and there were, of course, 17,000 some odd 700 papers on the topic. And then I did a knowledge co-production on top of that, and there were 2 papers. And then I did interdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary research, and there were just a few dozen more papers. So I decided that it was more important to focus on knowledge co-production as introducing it to people who might not be so familiar with it. So I will be discussing some key terms and concepts, and I hope that this inspires you to do the work. And I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. So I have actually worked as a scientist, as a biochemist, but that was a long time ago. And I do speak social sciences, and I hope that I still retain your interest, because I believe most of you are natural scientists, or at least quantitative scientists, economists. So before we start, I'd love to sort of clarify a couple of concepts of knowledge co-production in itself. I understand it as bringing together different types of knowledge to create a knowledge base to make better decisions and to be able to make develop more effective policies. And that's what I study, actually, different kind of power relations also that influence and trust and relationships. Stakeholders are usually understood as the people or groups of interest groups that have a stake at a given problem. But I and a lot of other researchers on this field are starting to expand it to us researchers. So we don't necessarily any longer separate. We see researchers as stakeholders because we come into that equation when we're working with others, particularly those non-academics, where we have our agenda in the terms of having to produce research, having our grant funding, having our institutional requirements and demands, and so on and so forth. So in general, I think it would be of value to even start talking about ourselves as stakeholders. Knowledge systems in terms is so social sciences talks about epistemologies. How do we make sense of the world? How do we study it? How do we measure it? How do we validate our knowledge? And that's not necessarily just academic. It's different types of ways of knowing. And an example of that is the Western scientific knowledge system that broadly verifies the validity of credibility of knowledge by peer-reviewed articles and such. And then the most important part and most interesting for this knowledge co-production is the disciplinary paradigms, the lenses that we use, the worldviews for the people who are not academic. How do we look at the world? What do we focus on? And the last 2 points here are the two, what are we doing it for? So there is the science policy interface where we're hoping that our research findings will be put into use in policy and governing. But then there is a practical, the one that I informally call science practice interface, where we are talking about governing practices, decision making and governing, and resilience of the communities and so on and so forth. So the aim is to try to bring our knowledge systems together and knowledge together. So, but that's not just bringing together. Disciplinary and multidisciplinary research is the type of research where we still using our own disciplinary training, exactly as is, framing the questions and problems the way we're used to doing, and doing it on our own or in our groups with our colleagues. But interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary are where we are actually starting to frame the problems together. So interdisciplinary referring to research where it's academics or researchers working together and defining a problem together and figuring out what the whole design and the process. We can and may engage non-academics, but basically just to gain information from them through workshops or studies or monitoring activities. Whereas transdisciplinary is when we engage the non-researchers and non-academics into research actually as equal partners, helping us to define the research problems, prioritize them, frame the questions, and design the research to whatever extent is appropriate. The foundation for knowledge co-production is really that we see forests, boreal forest, as complex social ecological systems. And this Fisher's paper here that is on the side here is showing very nicely time and space, temporal and spatial dimensions of forest governance, and the green ones are the biophysical events, and the blue ones are potentially different social societal events.
Out the whole forest as a system, as the trees, as the people impacting it, as the environmental factors. And the one thing that is a fact that we often don't take into consideration in our climate change studies is that climate change is not happening to a pristine environment. There is all the urban sprawl, there is all the human activities, both commercial and recreational. There is pollution. Then there are the social structures such as land ownership. There are policies that might not even be related to boreal forests, but are like environmental impact assessments for various like mining activities and stuff that influences the forest. So we in from the complex social ecological systems perspective, we can't just think about things, small things. We need to think about it as part of a greater deal. And I get to the next slide, and I do this fairly fast in the terms of it. Most of you are familiar with the elephant and the blind men. And it's the fact that when we focus on these tiny perspectives, we sort of don't see the forest for the trees. We may make interpretations that are not accurate or are misleading or misguided, and or are not practically usable for the people who need to use the knowledge. Next slide. So when we are working towards wishing to have the healthy, thriving, resilient boreal forest, what is the problem that we have all this knowledge and that we haven't gotten any further in these issues that we're dealing with? And I wanted to share an experience from one of the research studies that we did, because stakeholders who are non-academic often experience, and this is something we hear time after time, is that decisions are made somewhere else and they have no say, so it is not meaningful for them. And we did a study in Peru where we were investigating how scientific forestry research was influencing policy and practice. And there we actually had a beautiful case study where the federal government had worked with the researchers assessing the scientific base for regulations to support a specific law. And they did it by the book. They even invited the research assistants were from a local university in the region where that was mostly impacted by this regulation, and they stayed with the families. And as a result, these findings were put into the regulations explicitly as part of supporting the law. And then there was an election and something happened and it was removed again. And it was there where we went and interviewed people at the regional level and discovered that it was the regional forest enforcement officers and regional policymakers that felt that the scientists and the federal government had not asked them, not listened to them. So they actually, in a way, made sure that this regulation was changed back to how it was, and that the science was not part of it. And it's not. This is very typical. Not typical example, but this experience, how it's the societal factors that influence how science is used and how science is experienced. And that's where knowledge co-production and actually also co-governance come to play. And for the natural scientist here who not necessarily familiar with all these terms, this is governing is different from management in a way that we social scientists who work on this mean that management, you can't control and manage nature or land, so that it is probably governing is a broader concept that is more adaptive, although there is good adaptive goal management, but it's not trying to control to the same extent. And collaborative governance is actually where the knowledge co-production in forest scholarship came from. It is that is based on that deliberative, discussion-based, consensus-oriented decision making. And I know that a lot of you who have worked with it or studied it sometimes say that it doesn't work, but the part of it is that there are certain parameters about power and other aspects that need to come into play and mitigated. And that's part of this presentation, and part is outside of this presentation. But collaborative governance, the co-governance that emerged as a response to that top-down decision making that used to be typical for the forest management and sometimes still is, because it acknowledges and embraces the stakeholder perspectives, that there are a lot of different perspectives, and that is actually not a bad thing necessarily, because that it's sort of like a democracy, is that everybody brings in some perspective. But at the same time, that changes the power balance in terms of expertise. Power is shared with the local people, and it's also building their capacity and resilience. And there have been recently a lot of studies coming out, quantitative studies assessing these arrangements. And like Jaeger et al. Last year published a really interesting study from European water governance context, where they had 403 different case studies, and their findings demonstrated how there's a significantly improved outcomes and environmental outputs when there is a good communication intensity and participation, and people are actually given power to make a difference when they're trying to do something. And there is, okay, sorry. No, I forgot to say that next slide, please. Sorry. Are we on slide 9 now? Hello? Hello? Did I lose you?
Yes,
Okay.
we are on slide 9. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the next slide then. My apologies for this challenge.
Yep. Next slide, slide 10.
So I wanted to talk about, so resilience here, because as a side definition is that resilience of to people who have studied ecology, it usually means that bouncing back after stressors. But as we are now learning also in boreal forest context, that things are not returning because of the climate change, because of the biodiversity loss, because of the different kind of stressors that there are. And this, so there is this understanding of talking about bouncing. When we're building resilience, we're building and strengthening resilience. It's looking at something bouncing forward. And in biophysical, it means the survival and health of the forest in general. In a societal and social aspects, it actually is even more desirable, because a lot of the practices that we did before did actually cause the problems that we're dealing with. So it's just a different understanding of resilience, much broader, is that creating a system that can survive stressors and come out of it stronger than before, healthier and more sustainable than before. So next slide, please. And here, in the terms of why is knowledge co-production important for boreal forest governance, this kind of a, when I'm talking about co-governance and negotiations, that's when people are coming to table with the knowledge that they have and sharing that. But then the knowledge co-production is the science and research that we're doing together to improve. And as I talked before, this provides new kinds of actionable knowledge. It provides that kind of where people feel that they're part of the solution, and there is a better understanding of what the problems are. There's a shared understanding where we want to be going, or the people in question. And there is oftentimes capacity also for the researchers to learn more about the context and the social aspects of decision making, because when we have a knowledge, we still need to move it to action, and the governing aspects are where that's taken to the action. Next slide. So I previously said that there was not much research on knowledge co-production and boreal forest, but there are some, and some of them, as this one from 2009 has been cited 4,065 times, which is a lot for social sciences. But the key piece here that I wanted to highlight is that there are different ways of using knowledge co-production. It is bringing together, reframing the knowledge. It can be used for assessments, it can be used for planning, and that's where still the natural sciences and that information is incredibly important. And for those researchers who are used to doing things more conventionally and don't know where to start, the way that I would start as a researcher, in even as a social scientist, is once I have identified things that I am interested in and issues that I'm interested in and potential case studies, to reach out to people and start working with them before I design the research. And next slide, please. And this is to point out the real benefits of knowledge co-production, because we do need different lenses, these different disciplines, and particularly economic aspects are important for the rural communities that work on it, but we need the science, all aspects of science, in particular illustrated here with diseases and well-being of a tree, in order to create indicators, in order to understand what is going on, in order to understand all the different aspects that play into a healthy boreal forest. And the last piece here is the holistic aspect that I am sort of representing myself, because my focus is on planetary health, which is the ecosystem, planetary and plant and human health as outcomes of effective resource governance. So it's important to think when we're having the different kind of issues in climate change is that what are the different knowledge components that we need for a healthy boreal forest in a given situation? What do we need to know to get the whole picture and start working on the framing? Next slide. And one last aspect that I wanted to do, which is as a perspective outside of the academic lenses, but incredibly important and necessary for most boreal forest research, because it's indigenous people approximately everywhere in the boreal forest region, or at least most parts. And to understand that when they are approaching forest, traditionally, those people who still are having their traditional values intact, they see almost universally nature as a relation, and they have a relational and rights and responsibilities to it. And when you're working with for indigenous communities, I'm talking about First Nations because I have Canadian background, but is there are huge differences in individuals, obviously, and some people are more assimilated or adapted or colonized or whatever we want to say, use the term. But the point is that there's a whole different approach to seeing the world. And as a biochemist, I actually can relate to that in the terms of particularly because I'm interested in low dose impacts of endocrine disruptors, and they are universally influencing the hormonal control of early development in plants, animals, and people. So I'm not trying to belittle. So this is just one tiny component of the relationality of us being related to the environment, but and the indigenous perspectives are much wider and include values and ethics. But I think it's incredibly important when we're doing natural scientific research to understand that in those knowledge co-production context. Next slide, please. And why I highlighted that was actually in particular because of the IPCC report from 2 years ago in June, where they one of the things reported on was that the areas governed by indigenous people were significantly healthier than areas governed by non-indigenous people, and despite the colonialism and despite the different things that have happened to them, and how they are not included in decision making. But the part is here that they came out with a recommendation in September 2019 that we might be learning something from the perspectives of the for indigenous people when we're trying to find a way that is more sustainable in the governing the forest and the planets, and in general sustainable transitions. Next slide. So the part here is that there are these different lenses, and usually we consider those as a problem. But in knowledge co-production, that is the whole strength. That is what creates and helps to create a better picture of the whole, different things that need to be taken into consideration. Yet that leads to different types of disagreements and conflicts. And even when we think we agree, there are often slight nuances. And as an example, I want to highlight like conservation organizations in Canada often uh, assume that First Nations, the Indigenous people in Canada, would be their automatic partners in conservation. But like Frank Brown, a hereditary chief of Filchik Nation in BC, pointed out to me once in a conversation, is that Western conservation oftentimes is more like a museum. You go in there and you can't do anything, and for them it's a big part. It's a life, it's a lifestyle, it's part of what they are. And so they want to be their stewardship perspectives are more about living in the forest, with the forest, and taking care of it. And it's that type of things that need to be negotiated, understood, and respected. And there are power, trust issues, institutional restrictions, and that's where you can use a lot of social scientists and their knowledge in working and navigating through these when we're trying to put together the natural scientific knowledge and the social scientific knowledge in a way that it really can make a difference for the forest. And one of the problems what we're dealing right now, which I consider problem number 3, is that we have us, oftentimes white, um, highly educated people, often urban, um, assessing situations where we go in and we do our studies and we go out, but we don't see what it is to live in there. And I'm saying that despite the fact that I live rurally, but that's beside the point. So next slide. And I wanted to go a little bit more into practice to help people to see what it is that knowledge co-production actually, it is this process where we are mutually learning from one another. And there are 2 key pieces, in actually 3 key pieces in this I wanted to say. The one is that it requires us to understand where we are in the whole. What is our role in the big picture of boreal forest well-being, boreal forest governance, boreal forest management, and in relation to the other people who we work with, and what is our power situation? What are we coming in with, and how is our research influencing the whole? But it also, something that I've discovered that we need to talk about is that it's very unsettling when we going there and it's our professional credibility at stake, and we don't know how to assess if the other person's research is good or valid or rigorous. So not only do we, of course, need to select well who we work with, but also it's really important at the beginning of the project to really discuss these issues and talk about them and make them very transparent and accept the fact that we feel uncertain and sometimes uncomfortable, and it's okay. That's living with uncertainty. And the last thing was that part that we need to really think about what kind of knowledge is needed for what purpose. Next slide. You can go to the next slide. So this is an example for those who haven't worked in interdisciplinaries, that how it operates. This is just one way of doing it, but we have a idea of some problem, and then we identify, we do a little literature review. It doesn't need to be formal as such, of what is going on in our own field. And then we bring it to the table, and then we share that knowing with the team who is starting And sometimes you start with a small group of people, and then you sort of figure out what is the knowledge that is needed on top of that. And then you start thinking, so how do we want to approach it to address all these different, and how do we prioritize it, and so on and so forth. And then you design your respective research paths. So it is, you're still doing your research based on your own research disciplines and methods. This is not diluting your research in any way or manner. It's just that framing of the problem happens together, and then we think in advance how we're going to connect the things and what do we need to know and find out. So next slide. And this is an example actually of a recent paper of transdisciplinary research, which is where we invite the stakeholders to the table. And there they are part of framing the problem or identifying the problem and prioritizing, analyzing it, and exploring impacts together in different ways, whichever way it's appropriate. But the role is slightly different in the way that the science side leads the knowledge production, but the others are on equal foot, determining some aspects and sharing, and sometimes even as researchers. It all depends on the project, and I'm happy to discuss that much more. But their role is more to make sure that the knowledge that is produced is meaningful and useful in that practical context. And this is one way of looking at transdisciplinarity. I have other examples if anybody wants to discuss, but the main thing here is that the design and happens already in a planning phase. People, at least a core group of people, comes together from stakeholder groups. And I wanted to point out that I know that oftentimes when we see money a call for funding, and then you have to act really fast. So this kind of stuff takes time. But I also want to highlight that is oftentimes the failed applications that make the best future applications. So you can work and you can merge and you can work with people, and we just got I'm lucky to be part of a big European Union Horizon 2020 grant where we're 16 partners, and it was a merger of that kind of failed projects, but now it's an excellent, huge participatory process that is got a green light, and we're starting next month. So next slide. So I want to highlight that this knowledge co-production, and I hope I'm clear enough in it and not too repetitious, but there is still a scientific rigor, despite the fact that we can only assess each type of knowledge based on the lens or knowledge system that it was produced in. So we social scientists in each discipline or method, we have different ways of assessing ours and natural sciences respectively. And indigenous knowledge has to be assessed by the communities, and all indigenous knowledge is not traditional knowledge, and some indigenous people are also professionals and so on and so forth. But it's usually when you're working with communities, you validate the knowledge with the community and ensure that that the way it's being produced, if it's traditional, it's validated the way, where's the credible, reliable knowledge coming from on their terms. And then when it's a local knowledge that is, as for instance, oral knowledge and stories, then you triangulate or you use, there are different kind of methods to assess the validity of the knowledge. So science is done as science, and it's about the framing and how it fits in the fold that is the key. Next slide, please. So this is the example that I had, and I realized that because we we're a little late because there was a hiccups at the starting. So I won't spend more time on this. If anybody wants to read the paper, I'm just highlighting. This is a study I was not part of. I just use it because it has some really good points. It's an Indigenous community in northwestern Ontario, and they wanted to create a case study for knowledge co-production for non-timber forest products. And please, that includes their values and their way of doing. And they wanted to make sure that it's a meaningful participation for them. So they operate as research advisors in the development of, in this particular case, they created actually a platform that is helping in institutional arrangements, like if companies or individuals want to start working with them on the forest that they have on in this case, it was the non-timber forest products, but how do they ensure that they're doing it the right way? They have been co-producing knowledge in some ways since 1996 when they started this forest initiative. And then they developed even a land use strategy, but then they discovered that everybody else, it was all the outsiders who were on the driving seat, and they wanted to take charge. And this research created that platform. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight the things that they brought forward. It was about engaging and asking, listening and hearing. So asking about the community, what matters to the community, and what are the needs that they identify, and working with them of what kind of science is then needed to address those concerns, to find the common language. And when they then analyzed their results, they went back to the community and did be a ground truthing of validation. So even if you're doing natural scientific measurements of whatever kind for assessing the forest, the situation, or developing indicators for the health of the forest, or developing engineering products to be able to do something, you go back to the community and have an interaction throughout the process to make sure that people are on board and you're addressing their concerns, and vice versa, and they address your concerns. And then in this case, it was a framework that they developed, but it can be a product, it can be a, a holistic knowledge produced together. Next slide. This, I'll also refer to you to the paper there. This is an example of a European knowledge co-production, because there are huge differences between North American and European knowledge co-production processes, which might be partially because in Europe the governing bodies are probably have traditionally been more top down, but are being very open to trying to interpret and start using these. So there are a lot of municipalities and regional decision makers who are really eager to develop different kind of co-produced knowledge. So these are just different components that you need to think about. It's how you share knowledge, how you collect knowledge. There were workshops, learning labs, interviews, and hackathons, case studies to really operationalize it with the champion users. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to illustrate, I was originally going to tell you the story. This is a knowledge cooperation challenges that we had, but workshops are a central piece of, this is where people come together and plan. This is from a project that we were planning with Canadian Biosphere Reserves. Maureen Reid was the PI. I was at the time research associate. And we can go to the next slide, so that it's just the workshop is very, very central for all kinds, and bringing people together, and we have written a paper about having professional or skilled facilitators to avoid conflicts and address the power differences, and and even us as scholars, we got a feedback that sometimes we were not hearing the stakeholders. So it requires a lot of self-reflection and thinking on your feet and adapting. Citizen science used to be something like bird watchers, or in the forest, just people were taking notes and sharing it with scientists to have a better monitoring system, but it has become much more significant, and it is actually used in many places as a complementary to decision making. And for instance, in Canada, it's not citizen science as per se, but indigenous guardians who are being on the water and on the land fishing and hunting anyway, are having mobile phone apps where they are actually documenting at the same time what is going on the land and collecting that data. And some people are doing that as part of living too. So next slide. Living labs is a different form. It's an actual site. It came from information and communication technology sector, but it's now more popular in Europe. But it's an idea of creating a space and co-creating and identifying a real life situation where you can explore and experiment with innovations. And this is where a lot of scientists are are actually getting really excited. And I'll share a story. This is my last example here. If you can go to the next slide. Um, this is a Natural Resources Institute Finland project where they were part. It's a huge European Union funding again, and there was a case study in Finland. This was before my time, but Katrina Soini, my colleague, was central in developing this co-design, co-development, co-deployment. So implementation for this nature-based solutions for climate change issues. And why I'm sharing this is this, that some of my colleagues, natural scientists, who one of them said that this was an eye-opening, life-changing experience for her, and now she is leading a European Union grant application to do that in her own research. That the participatory approach and co-design for their restoration project. So this is just the part, is that doing collaboratively can be from and needs to be from the get-go to get people's buy-in and to eliminate these to minimize the resistance, enable change, but also to create better science. So this is really not at all of doing any different science technically as you have done. It's basically just the framing piece and putting it as part of something larger. Next slide, please. The future potential. I was originally going to tell you more about the research that has existed, but I think that has been done. But I just thought that maybe when you're looking at your own research and you think about it, where are you at? What are the problems that you are really concerned about? And then start thinking, what are the kinds of knowledge? Who could be working with me in making better better science together? And from the social sciences perspective, for the natural scientist, is that, because this is one thing that we struggle a lot in our organization when we're invited to come to these collaborative research projects, because the European Union requires them, a lot of funders are requiring them now, is that we're not facilitators necessarily, and we're not communicators. We don't know knowledge translation. We're not trained by it. I happen to have knowledge translation background solid because I've been a practitioner, and that's what I studied in my my second master's was from science to policy, but social sciences and humanities study different aspects of the social structures, and we have different skills and different perspectives and different lenses. Each of us, some of us study more process, some of us study more the social interaction and psychology or conflict resolution or bigger picture future policy possibilities and different policy tools. And so it's really central that when we're building these research projects is to identify what we need and then ask, or when we reach out to people, ask them what is it that interests them in that particular thing. And then societal players, I'd like to bring attention to the unusual ones. You probably never thought that public health could be an interesting partner, but public health is actually much more ahead of the forest research in engaging in environmental aspects of not just human health, but also other aspects. One Health, veterinary vets are working on One Health, in particular in Alaska. There's very interesting research going on and experimentation. So inviting people from all the levels of policymakers and bureaucrats from the higher governments and local governments, NGOs, all that type of things, organizations that might help to bring the knowledge together, like bridging organizations like biosphere reserves or other local organizations. So next slide. That was pretty much it for me. I hope that this wasn't too much of a wishy-washy from your perspective about things that are self-evident. I was trying to bring forth the issues that I have run into when trying to build research teams from different disciplines and experiences from our research previously. So if I know you might not have questions now, but you're welcome to get in touch with me, and you're also welcome to, I hope that we could get together in that conference in some forum to start talking about this kind of things. So that was all for me.